All right, so hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Felicia Fuller, and I am the Director of Operations here at GBRI. And today's webinar is being brought to you in partnership with the Collaborative for High Performance Schools, or CHIPS. While we wait for everyone to join, let me go ahead and introduce you to GBRI. We are a privately owned online gamified education platform with a mission to make sustainability resources available and accessible to everyone around the world. We are located in New York City with a presence around the world. We are a USGBC education partner and AIA provider with partners such as the UN SDGs, CHIPS, and the Rhode Island Energy Efficiency Council. We believe a truly sustainable future must also be an equitable one where every human is treated equally and fairly. Our mission is to make sustainability, health and wellness education available and affordable to everyone around the world. With hundreds of sustainability courses surrounding the topics of energy, water, LEED, and sorry, it keeps switching on me, LEED and net zero, just to name a few. Learning Hub at GBRI is your one-stop shop for all of your education needs. So today's session has been approved by AIA for one HSWLU, and a certificate of completion will be shared will be available for download after today's session. And for those of you that are wanting to receive LEED or WELL CE credit, we will be sending the details needed to self-report this course after today's session. And with that, I would like to now hand things over to Craig Schiller. Craig, welcome.
Thank you, Felicia. And as always, thank you, GBRI, for hosting these great webinars. I'm going to do a quick introduction, and you'll see me at the beginning and the end of this webinar. My name is Craig Schiller. I'm the Executive Director for the Collaborative for High Performance Schools, or CHIPS. And I'll talk about what CHIPS is in a moment here. I'll do a few minutes of just introduction to this webinar and our organization. And then we're going to hand most of the time for our two speakers, Dr. Erika Eitland and Tracy Enger. We've done about 10 of these webinars now with CHIPS, and we always have some great speakers. These two in particular, I'm extremely excited about. And for those of you who don't know either of these individuals, you will by the end of this webinar. My suggestion is find them on LinkedIn, follow them, look them up, find the webinars that they've done. These are two incredibly powerful voices, and they will continue to be so over the decades of their career. I strongly encourage you to that when they speak or post something that you listen. Dr. Eitland, or Erika, is on our board and has already had a huge influence on our organization and the direction we're going. So I'm very excited to have them speak very shortly. With that said, Felicia, the next slide. A couple of housekeeping things. We do have a chat box and a Q&A section. My guidance and advice to you is if you have a question you'd like the panelist or myself to answer, put it in the Q&A section. I will be answering the questions I can live, and I'll be fielding your questions to Tracy and Erika at the end. If you have some regular comments, chats, introductions, where you're from, etc., please put those in the chat. That helps me filter and organize. This is going to be recorded, so please have your mics on mute, etc. And goes for our speakers when we're not speaking as well. There's gonna be a lot of content in this slide. We will share the recording afterwards, so do not worry. All of these slides will be available for you. All right, next. Just a quick introduction of CHIPS. For those of you who don't know, we are a nonprofit. As our name suggests, we are a collaborative of building, health, and education professionals, all dedicated to make our education and our built environment for schools better. We do that by providing technical resources. Right now, our main programming is in building criteria, similar to LEED or WELL. We have a large set of criteria for schools that are specific to schools and have a higher priority on student health and performance, but also include things like energy and water, very similar to LEED. We as an organization pride ourselves on our technical prowess and our education abilities, like these webinars. To do that, we do rely on membership. So if you are interested in joining the movement to improve the school system that we have, please consider joining and visit us on our website to find more. Next, Felicia. Just a quick overview. We have over 700 schools that are CHIPS verified in the US. We have 14 states that rely on CHIPS or LEED or Green Globes to provide their buildings with a higher level of criteria. For CHIPS, we have 60 school districts that are committed to using CHIPS for all the school districts. So we're very excited that we have been growing in that way to help make sure our schools are better than the baseline. Next slide. With that said, all of this, as I mentioned, is possible through our sponsors and our member support. This webinar series, which we've had 11, will be next month. This is our 10th, is provided to you by these generous sponsors. So if you like what you see, if you like what you hear, please reach out and we can talk about what we're going to do next for our webinar series and who we can collaborate with. This series has all been about building school building science. And that is what the CHIPS bread and butter is. So I'm going to frame that because most of our webinars have been very technical on the design, operation, construction, or occupancy of a school building. That's what we're known for. That's what we do. However, I want to caveat that what this webinar is going to be about and what I have been convinced, Tracy, what you and Erika have convinced me on, is that we can no longer consider the school building science to be about the built environment. That is too narrow. We need to talk about the systemic, the structural, and the community aspects that impact our children, how they learn and thrive. So from now on for CHIPS, when we talk about the body of knowledge that impacts our students, we're not going to take the built environment and it's by itself, we're going to expand our boundaries. Because as we will all hear in a moment, that is very important, essential. These are the learning objectives for this webinar. So I will remind the speakers of these webinars, which they created, and I'll remind you of the audience that we're trying to get out of this. If you have any questions related to these objectives, again, please put them in the chat. Myself or the audience, the speakers will answer those throughout the webinar and at the end. Okay, with that said, no more delay. Let's have our wonderful host take it over.
Craig, thank you so much. And, I also want to extend my, both Erika and my appreciation to you and to Felicia and to the work that you do and for offering this amazing platform for us all to be able to come together into this conversation. So you saw the objectives, and we are certainly during the course of this webinar going to be addressing those objectives, looking at how the work that we do in the school built environment has an impact on health and on outcomes for students, but also on how those community health burdens impact that student even before they get into that building, and what it means for them to be living and existing in that space and what we can do to impact it as well. So we will be setting the stage, talking about the problem a little bit, and then talking about how we advance towards restorative justice and what that means. So setting the scene a little bit, I want to prepare you for the fact that today we will not be giving a presentation, okay? Instead, what we are offering is an invitation into a conversation. And recognizing that a conversation is a really powerful thing because the word conversation really means to change together. When you are in powerful conversation, both you as the speaker and the listener should be changed by that experience. And so that's what we're hoping to have happen with you today. And so we're going to be in a conversation where we are sharing our insights and our experiences and some of the moments of transformation that we have had in this work, with the hopes that it will help you tap into your own experiences so that you can add your voice to this ongoing conversation that is ultimately about changing some of the fundamentally important things that we are engaged in our work and in our world. So by way of introduction, for myself, I am a returned Peace Corps volunteer, and I entered into Peace Corps. I'll be transparent with you. I entered into Peace Corps with motives that were not exactly altruistic. Okay, they were a little self-interested, but the experience was so powerful for me that I fell in love with service, and especially with public service and with servant leadership. And this is where I fell in love, at Sumbuya Secondary School in Sierra Leone, West Africa. And this is where I learned so many lessons in service and leadership and the power of education, and I got my passion for schools. And what I learned there is that people everywhere, all over the world, all want the same things for their children. They want their kids to have the best education that they can in a safe, clean, healthy environment that they can be proud of, and to give their kids a chance to do just a little bit better than they did. Everybody wants the same thing. So when I came to EPA, I was really excited to be working on this indoor air quality management program in schools, indoor air quality tools for schools. And as I began to travel around with this work with EPA, I've worked with hundreds of schools across the country. And I've seen schools that have made my spirit soar. And I have seen schools that have broken my heart, sometimes in the same day, sometimes in the same district. And I've also heard school administrators talk about things like applying the Robin Hood principle, this idea of robbing, the rich to give to the poor in order to achieve something that comes close to the appearance of equity. And what they were really talking about without realizing it was this concept you see here, this concept of restorative justice. It was an innate understanding these leaders had of the harm that some students were experiencing and a drive to achieve healing and justice for those students. So the question for me was, how is my work on indoor air quality in schools connected to this idea of equity and justice? So, and what would it take for me to advance equity, healing, and justice in my work? And I realized that in those schools that made me cry, it takes more than just implementing an indoor air quality program. I didn't have a label for it at the time, but now we know that what it requires is environmental restorative justice. To truly protect people from harm would require that I engage in dialogue, direct participation, and accountability with these school district communities. But what does that mean? And what does it look like? Well, part of the problem is I firmly believe that we have allowed ourselves to accept intolerable situations in our school buildings. A 100-year-old house, we treat like a historic treasure. We repair it, we restore it, we put plaques on it so that nobody misses it, so that we can honor it. But when you have a 100-year-old school, what do? We condemn it to a slow, painful death from neglect and despair. So because of that, I have a little bit of a problem with terms like equity and disparities and even environmental justice, because to me, they're a little too sanitized and too detached, and they're jargony, and it makes us think and believe that we don't know what they mean when we really do know what they mean. Because basically what these words mean is that because of the way a child looks, or how much money that child makes, or the zip code of the school they attend, that child is more likely to have asthma. They're more likely to be exposed to asthma triggers in schools that cause an asthma attack. And if they are a Black or brown child, they're more likely to die from that asthma attack. They are more likely to die from a disease that is manageable and we know how to manage, from asthma triggers that are controllable and we know how to control. That's not a disparity. That's a disgrace. That is a miscarriage of justice. We need more than just interventions to deal with that. We need to repair and to heal and to restore. We need environmental restorative justice to transform our work in a way that demonstrates that we will not tolerate what we know is intolerable in our school buildings. So the educational system, the school system has kind of come to really realize and recognize and acknowledge that students and kids have differing needs that are based on a variety of issues. So my kid fell into that category that you see there around autism and developmental delay. So he got an IEP, he got an individualized educational plan, right? Once I saw that this thing existed, I'm like, and why doesn't every kid have an individualized education plan, right? So the individual education plan is a resource to deal with children with learning differences. And school systems have acknowledged that these students have not been treated equitably and that there has been harm done. And the IEP is a method for addressing that harm and creating repair in a collaborative way. The IEP is a tool for schools to use to institute educational restorative justice to students who've been harmed. So here's the thing, school buildings, school facilities in and of themselves are unbiased. They're going to function the way that they are planned, designed, operated, and maintained regardless of who's in them, regardless of what the occupants look like. However, the occupants and the operators of these buildings often are disproportionately affected by factors like their ability to do preventive maintenance and health outcomes and health access and academic performance. These things are subject to extreme bias and inequities. So what I propose, what Erika and I propose, is that in our work, we use an IEP for school facilities, an individualized equity plan that take these factors into consideration in our work. And what does that mean? It means remembering that kid with asthma, right? It means prioritizing the schools that are creating the most harm. It means bringing equity to all the factors that contribute to the three-legged stool of healthy school environments: the facility management, health, and academic performance. Remember that kid with asthma, right? So it means prioritizing the schools and the students that are most harmed by failing building systems. It means recognizing that increasingly schools are the place where students are getting access to healthcare. In fact, with school-based health centers on the rise, it is the place where a lot of students are getting their primary healthcare. And it means understanding that the achievement gap is fueled by the opportunity gap, and looking at the reasons for the achievement gap and not just at the results. And then that means us taking accountability in our work for addressing those reasons, like debilitated facilities, like overcrowded classrooms that impact and contribute to poor student performance, poor outcomes, and continued harm. So what we would propose to you, what we would implore you to do, is to see your work as planning, designing, and operating for a school-centered educational home. We know that schools do much more than just deliver curriculum. In many cases, the school is going to be the cleanest, safest, healthiest place that child is going to spend time. We have a job here. So we need a place that privileges the student at the center of an array of services in a school facility that is building equity and operationalizing environmental restorative justice to repair harm and ensure dignity for all students, all staff, all communities. So let's get to it. Okay.
Oh, all righty, people. So we're in it together. Tracy and I have had a lot of energy and thought going into this, and it's been definitely a deeply reflective one for ourselves. And Tracy set it up beautifully. We have to be thinking about facilities, health, and academic inequities. And yes, those are sterile terms, but I think what's important for me is that we have to start with our health motivations first. And so one thing, we're pleased to be here and sort of a part of this with CHIPS, because so many of these features, these are, when I was at Harvard as a doctoral student and leading some of the school's research there, we found that these were key environmental factors that drove student health thinking and performance. And we wrote a long report about it where we reviewed 30 years of research. And we found that there was 70 indicators of student success that went way beyond test scores, whether it be asthma, absenteeism, concentration. And so these are fundamental things. We know these relationships exist. We're exposed to these conditions of thermal health, noise, acoustics. But what was was really important for me is that when I joined Perkins&Will, I thought those 9 foundations would be what I brought to the second largest architecture firm as the first public health scientist, and wasn't that great. And yet what happened was 3 weeks later, the pandemic hit, and we realized we needed a much more holistic lens when we thought about addressing equity and health in our schools. And so we saw a rise in child abuse, the digital divide, the rise in individualized technology, food and housing insecurity. And so much like Tracy's 3-legged stool, it was important for us to go beyond the physical conditions where we must mitigate risk, but how are we going to meet students where they are? How are we going to empower teachers to adapt to those conditions that they're dealt with? And so what this brought to me was, okay, well, what is the prevalence of these health conditions? And our current child health crises in this country right now are showing that there is that inequitable distribution of resources for prevention. And we know that these health outcomes are related to losses of attendance, learning, self-esteem, and safety. And what's important to this conversation about environmental restorative justice is that in the US, only 32% of the population is Black or Hispanic, but these children disproportionately experience the burden of the action or inaction that we are taking in our schools. And so to me, this is where our opportunity lies. It is an economic opportunity where we see that if we started to think critically about how we address obesity, there is a lot for us to gain. When we think about this pandemic, it was much more than air quality that impacted our students. In a study of nearly 500,000 children, they found that the rate of body mass index increased nearly doubled during the pandemic compared to pre-pandemic period, and that the fastest increase was most pronounced in children who were already overweight or obese and younger school-age children. And so as I come at this from a design and operations lens, I think about, well, have we designed our buildings with a health-first approach? Have we thought about how our K-12 spaces can ameliorate these types of health crises that face them? And just as Tracy talked about it, asthma is an important indicator of health outcomes, because for many of our students, this is the #1 reason they are missing school. Before the pandemic, we saw that there was 14 million school days missed a year due to asthma. We saw that there was billions of dollars lost because of missed work days for parents taking care of kids that were missing school days because of an asthma exacerbation. And that it was disproportionately falling on our students of color as well as our low-income students. And so we have to get to this point where we say enough is enough. And to me, I would argue that we have known that there has been an indoor environmental justice issue for a long time. We often talk about outdoor and siting issues and proximity to roadway, and yet we have studies from 7 years ago that even document that our Black and Hispanic students and low-income students are typically in low or under-ventilated spaces, as well as in spaces that are not properly tempered for their learning performance. And so what these graphs are showing is that you see that kids that are on free and reduced lunch are constantly in places that they are underperforming. The building is underperforming, and so we also know that the students are underperforming. And so this is, to me, where we have to be thinking about how do we build on environmental justice activism, because this is where the restorative piece has to come in. We have to act on the information and data that we know. And the reason I think we are uniquely prepared to do this now as designers, as facility managers, is the fact that our kids are spending 15,000 hours in these spaces, in our care, in places that we know that they are going to have their lungs grow until the age of 18, that their circadian rhythm is going to be more sensitive daylight than their adults. They're going to double in height from the age of 5 to 12. And so during this time is this critical opportunity for us to think about how are we going to optimize that 15,000 hours, because outside of their home, we trust our kids in those spaces. And, I think it's lovely when we say, well, we have all of these other certifications and programs available to us, and we have standards that we build our K-12 schools to. But I would argue that they fundamentally miss the uniqueness of children, which is physiologically, we know they are different. in so many ways. We know that behavior-wise, they're occupying unique spaces like the ground, the floor, outdoors, their hands are in their mouth, and that's going to cause different exposures. We know that they also have different efficacy. We know that they are unable to communicate. My thermal comfort is off today. Can we turn the thermostat down? That ain't happening in a second grade classroom. When it also is an opportunity for us to think about growth. Now, we can think about it from an academic perspective, where we know this is a critical time for learning and education, but it's also one about our socialization, about our neuro and cognitive brains developing, where we're seeing that we're adding all these neurons and shucking off the ones we don't need, and how are we going to optimize that experience for them? And, I understand that, kids are a big portion of this, but this is the same stuff for our teachers. We see that they have the highest rate of occupational asthma after mining workers. Well, let that sink in. It's crazy. And so how did we get here? And why do I think we're at a point where restorative justice is actually an opportunity for us? Is that we have to acknowledge our funding practices in our schools. And, back 100 years ago, we had a fixed amount per student. And yet, over time, we started to change the way that we were evaluating this, where we were providing money for achievement, we were providing money based on local taxes, and we had to sort of respond in different ways. But it gets to what Tracy was talking about in terms of an opportunity gap versus an achievement gap. And so what we're seeing is even during the 2008 recession, we cut money to our schools to fund our capital investments, to make sure that our kids were in high performing spaces. But now with, influxes of money coming into our K-12, we have to acknowledge that we need to act, we need to use those resources, because it is estimated that $7 trillion is the estimated loss in lifelong learning for students experiencing school closures, according to the UN, as of 2021. And that is equivalent to the GDP of China and Japan combined. So we have an incredible opportunity to overcome this life loss, these learning and income losses that we're experiencing. Because what we see is that our smaller schools, our city and our rural schools are constantly taking that burden. We see that students that are actually of the highest needs, so our kids that are on free and reduced lunch, for those in an international audience, this is a measure of how disadvantaged that school is, how many kids need that extra assistance. And what we see is that these are the same kids that are in the oldest buildings that are going to be exposed to stuff that predate important environmental legislations that keep our kids safe, whether it's lead in drinking water, PCBs in caulking. We have to acknowledge that we are leading to intergenerational trauma in these spaces if we are not thinking about it through this lens. And, when we think about, well, who gets a better building, we have to also ensure that we are thinking about it through multiple scales here, because it's about what is happening at home with our families, who is able to actually take on that commitment of advocacy to action. What is our student bringing with them? How are they feeling empowered? Are they experiencing challenges of homelessness or English language learning? How do we make sure that we're supporting those needs so that we are being tailored in our design approach? And then it comes to the buildings. If we're going to be thinking about the future or new buildings, there's an opportunity for us to really push forward and think about siting as well as the physical environment that they're in. And, one thing that Tracy and I could have done this, presentation is soak you guys in numbers. And there are so many incredible reports that have come out in the last 2 years, even from, the Government Accounting Office, from the State of Our Schools report, which is where this quote is from USGBC. We are documenting what this has caused and what we need to do next. And so as Tracy and I move into this next part of the presentation, it's about from our own sort of lived experience of how are we going to advance restorative justice in more of a personal way and not through the numbers and sort of reports that we've read so far. So I'll turn it back over to Tracy.
Thanks, Erika. One of the things I love about that previous quote is when it talks about being able to achieve our academic outcomes and the things that we are trained on, and we cannot do that even with the best curriculum in crumbling facilities. And and I just like to remind people all the time that the building is a part of the curriculum. That building that we are working in is as much a part of the pedagogy of education as anything else. And we tend to take our best brains, our best curriculum, our best teachers, our best technology, and put them into a dilapidated body of a building. And then we're shocked when we don't get amazing outcomes academically and health-wise. Well, that is because that building has that impact. And everyone who operates that building, everyone who works in that building, who teaches in that building, we are all educators, we're all facility managers, we're all healthcare professionals, each and every one of us. So when we come into that work, we have to come into it with that full view. So in advancing restorative justice, so when we look at the characteristics of restorative justice, it can feel a little daunting for us, right? You know, when we think about how is it in the work that we do as designers, as architects, as, you know, maybe myself with, you know, with EPA, where I have a, you know, an indoor air quality, you know, management program, as technicians, as providers, how do we engage in environmental restorative justice in school buildings that is healing oriented and, you know, helps hold, you know, create accountability by, you know, taking, you know, recognizing that those in power can take direct responsibility for change. How do we do all of these things, right? And storytelling and dialogue. Well, here's the good news. The good news is that every one of us in all of our disciplines have competencies that allow us to be able to live into these characteristics in the work that we do in school buildings. And so I wouldn't have I didn't realize it when we were doing it, right? That what we were doing was environmental restorative justice. What I did know was that in my work at EPA, I discovered that we needed to do things a different way for certain school districts who were differently challenged, right? That individualized equity plan. So we needed to be engaging with them differently. And it became really crystallized for me, especially in dealing with the Recovery School District of New Orleans. So we work with lots of different school districts, urban districts, the suburban districts, you know, school districts all over the place. And 5 years after Katrina, we were working with the Recovery School District of New Orleans. And it was called the Recovery School District at the time because even before Katrina, the majority of schools had been taken out of the power and control of their local school boards and given over to a recovery committee who was working to advance them because they were failing academically. So that was kind of the focus that the recovery, you know, plan had, was to get these schools, you know, to get achievement up, but not necessarily really looking at the opportunity gaps that were there that were preventing it. So when we went to work with the Recovery School District of New Orleans, we borrowed a technique from the architectural world. We decided that we wanted to identify a handful of challenged school districts. I'm going to stay there for a minute. We identified a handful of students of schools that agreed to present themselves as design challenged school districts. And we went to visit them all and we engaged in those conversations. We talked with their leadership. We asked what was important. And what we discovered was that even when we thought we were coaching them on how to, you know, create indoor air quality plans, they were coaching us on environmental restorative justice. And the Recovery School District of New Orleans had these principles baked right into their mission and goals. So in their mission, it was to put academically struggling schools on the path towards success. But when we asked them what their key challenges were that they wanted people to help them address, one of their key challenges was managing community expectations about that building while creating a sense of fairness and equity, knowing that rebuilding takes time. So they were already trained on these ideas and helping us figure it out. So we brought together 500 attendees from across the country to conduct a charrette, a collective design process for 5 school districts across the country. We put people into teams. Each of the school districts had 10 teams designing just for them over 2 days. These school districts shared their stories. They all worked together with their teams. They rallied together. They railed together. They cried together. And then those teams gifted them with what came out of their heads and their hearts and their hands. They gave them a designed IAQ plan for each design challenge school district. They all walked away with 10 plans that focused not just on improving the facility's indoor air quality, but addressing their desire for equity, healing, pride, and justice. And what we did, and you can see here, people were so excited to bond as a community with these school districts. They walked away with colleagues and friends and a network and support of other school stakeholders from across the country. And they took those plans home, and we got pictures from Philadelphia and from Ponca City and from New Orleans about how they put up their presentations in their meeting rooms so that everyone could see them, and to keep themselves accountable to this messaging and to what they were doing and to a bigger picture of equity and justice for all of their students. And we at EPA were able to create that container using the charrette technology that we borrowed from the architectural world. We know how to do this. We can do this. We know how. We know how. Erika, tell them what else we know.
So what else do we know? So if we apply this though to a specific building, I want to share something, and we promised Craig some time for questions, so I might go through this fast, but maybe in questions, if there's more stuff we want to dive into, we can. But I want to share this story about, it's a Boston public school, and it is really something quite special, because when we talk about those 5 principles of environmental restorative justice, it is healing oriented. So these are students who are living with different conditions, whether it's cortical visual impairment, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, and these are students that normally would die in childbirth, and yet because of medical advancements are able to live through adulthood. And so it is a very unique population where when we talk about, thinking about health, it is not a like to have, it's a must have. And yet for the principal of the school, he was keen on the fact that he wanted his students to be seen as learners and not as medical patients. But what's so important about these types of students with cognitive, visual, auditory disabilities is that they're typically institutionalized, especially for people of color. And so you have this legacy of just an even more advanced version of racism and environmental racism playing out. So when it comes to the Carter School, these are kids that we are trying to think about, how do we design for those 9 foundations, but also the 7 senses that are going to help them learn and understand the world around them, because we're trying to do the work that's going to move them forward so they can communicate. So these are these incredible students and the staff that is so committed to seeing them succeed and communicate and share in that. And so this is why, for us, it was incredibly important. This project actually started right at the beginning of the pandemic. We got to visit, before lockdowns, but it really required a lot of responsibility and identification of the harms that they were experiencing in their current space. And their existing building is one where you can't even get 2 wheelchairs down the hallway together. So we are realizing that this was a space that they have been in for decades that was not designed for them. And so for us, we wanted to understand, what did they want? And the power, and exactly what Tracy was getting at about storytelling and dialogue and having that shared engagement. I want to share a short 2-minute video, I promise, because I think it captures what all of those individuals walked away with and what they had to offer us. So hopefully you all can hear it.
This to me is one of the most exciting days that we've had together. We've been working years and years and years to get to this point. It's been a lot of rushing to wait, a lot of dreaming, and now today is the day where we really get to put into action all that we believe that we can accomplish for our school, who we are as the Carter School. These visioning sessions are really going to provide our design team with the opportunity to deeply learn more about who we are as a school. This is their time to really find out who the Carter School is as a community, what we value, what we believe, and how that will translate into creating our dream school for our students?
It took us until it was almost time for him to graduate to realize that he was communicating with us because he couldn't see, but he could hear everything. So everything was pretty much scaring him.
So happy that we've really heard everyone's voice, just to see how important that everyone felt that this process was to step outside your comfort zone.
So all of this to say is that that visioning session was important because the staff that is helping these students, by having sort of a virtual platform, by being able to connect with them in this digital way, we were actually able to reach more of them and have that ongoing communication for over 2 weeks of that, and then continue to have those moments of storytelling and engagement, because otherwise we wouldn't know what we were solving. So just to wrap up, basically what did this mean? Is that once you hear these things, you can't unhear them, you can't unknow them. And so for me, it was about this issue of responsibility and accountability to the design profession, is that I believe all designers should be public health professionals. And the idea of equity is translating into, this inclusive sensory garden, because these are kids living in public housing where their parents are literally picking up their adult children and carrying them up 3 flights of stairs because they do not have an elevator. This is talking about daylighting, because we know these kids are extremely sensitive to glare, and yet they don't have access to views of nature around them. And so how do we manage glare while still giving them access to biophilic spaces? It's also about thinking about, if you cannot visually see, how do we find other ways to have senses be activated through texture and smell? And so thinking about how we can make sure that those students who cannot see are not scared as they're moving through their space. And lastly, this auditory buffer. If we are thinking about how we are going to promote learning, reducing other distractions for people who are trying to learn new languages and communicate for the first time, we have to be buffering against some of these other challenges. And so although this is a super specialized case, should be things that we do for all of our schools. This isn't like a nice thing for these students. It is actually a quest that we should be on for all of our students, because we know that they're more sensitive than adults. And so as we wrap up, it is really where next. And so, and talking to Tracy about this, we were thinking about how do these sort of 5 pillars reflect and impact your chances of sort of bringing this into the process. And so draft an IEP, an individualized equity plan. The one that we provided in this presentation is from Roanoke. It's an incredible equity plan, but they forgot the building. We can do better. We can also understand the health priorities. If your community is struggling with asthma, how do we design a building to address that? Or is it bullying and harassment? We understand that there are limited resources, and yet we can be directed to what that community needs, not what we think they need. When it comes to direct responsibility, this is an opportunity for us to think about opportunity gaps, as well as thinking about objective measures, whether this is sensors or other sort of kind of continual reporting from teachers sharing how they feel. And that gets to storytelling and dialogue. It's about that depth of how do we build trust in relationships. When it comes to identifying harm, we know that, asbestos, lead, those were bad things. But when it comes to making better decisions, how are we not going to repeat things like asbestos and lead? And so where does healthy material selection fit in? Where does environmental controls fit in? And lastly, the accountability. I, as a public health person, believe in the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. And I think designers need to hold themselves to that same level, is that our work is only a healthy building once it's occupied. And we need to continue to evaluate it. Has it actually been performing in that way? As well as, should we set an indoor environmental quality standard? We have outdoor air quality standards, but not indoor. And this is an opportunity for us to engage states, think about policy, and where do we go next? And so, we would be amiss to not acknowledge sort of who our partner is with this today. And so real quick, in looking at all of these different certifications, and looking at CHIP specifically, though, what was really exciting is that under these different criteria, there was so many opportunities to think about some of these restorative justice practices in this own sort of approach. And so for all of you, I really would recommend taking a deeper look, because underneath each one of these categories is so many micro decisions we can make to push towards a more restorative justice future. And so on that note, I'm going to just end with this quote that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And that was really what Tracy and I wanted to do today, is make sure that now you know, so now we got to do better. And if you love Tracy and I, an important plug is Tracy drops a lot of knowledge in this podcast episode, and would love for you to sort of continue this conversation with us, because the work is just starting. It's about where we go next, though. So with that, I will turn it over to Craig.
Wow, when I gave my guidance advice in the very beginning, I said when you two talk that we should all listen, and we did. This is the first time I see no chats or Q&A. And my interpretation for that is, like myself, that was so much knowledge, that was so thought-provoking that it's almost hard to ask a concrete question, because it shifted my mindset from, okay, how do we specifically design a school building? How do we focus on replicating or building on other school buildings and best practices, to, wait, hold on a second, let's shift our paradigm thinking towards one of being a designer to being a child health professional first, a designer second. So I'm gonna let everybody take a second to breathe and think if they can come up with a question or two. I got the fortunate opportunity to look at this presentation first, so I was able to do. Thank you, Michael. Michael, I totally agree. I had a couple of questions specifically based on the presentation that was for this audience. Number one, this audience and most of GBRI, most of CHIP's network is designers and building professionals. Erika, I completely agree that there are few professions that have the lasting impact, both physically that we see and also in how it defines a community, than architects and designers. I think that's one of the beauties and the joys of the profession, but it's also one of the responsibilities. So specifically for architects and designers, what can we do to help implement an individualized equity program, Tracy? Something you brought up in the very beginning. How do we as designers work with a school system or in an RFP to start going one or two notches towards what you're talking about?
Yes, I'll open it up and then I'll turn it over to Erika, who, because I can say anything about what I think, architects ought to do, but she's actually, kind of working with them. But
that's why I asked you first. I want to get the unbiased opinion.
But we have seen it. So, in the same way that, I've been in school districts who've been under class action lawsuits because they, worked with, a design and construction firm that they created a template for how these schools should be built based on sort of the climate or whether, and then they repeated that same design in 5 schools, regardless of whether it was sited next to a highway, regardless of whether, without regard to the actual individual characteristics of that community or the students in it. And then they got and their ability to maintain that building, and they would run into all of these problems. And so, in the same way, like I said, with the individual education plan for the student, it doesn't throw away the whole curriculum, right? It starts from the same kind of foundational educational base. What it does, though, then is engage in a way with that student, with the parent, with the teachers, with everyone around them, to say, okay, so how does this basic curriculum, how do we adjust it? How do we accommodate? How do we provide accommodations that are appropriate to getting the best outcomes for this student? And I think that that's the conversation that you want, that architects, designers, builders all want to be in. And it may not even be a conversation. I didn't know that I needed that conversation as a parent until, someone helped me understand it, right? And so even introducing that concept that starts from, so what's your mission? What are you really after here for these kids? And I think that does happen a lot, but also being able to give that lens so that you are then tailoring those accommodations to that basic design that's more meaningful.
So the big takeaway for me then is, as practitioners here, we often use case studies as we did this, I'm gonna do that again for you.
Right.
Let's change that mindset for the process that led to this. I can replicate that process in a different circumstance to get an equally great result.
Exactly. Yes. Ding, ding, ding.
Excellent.
Well, and I
Great.
think what's important here to that even is that how do we tailor to health? And I think, what I really love going to first, and there's a couple of resources. CDC Places is an incredible sort of spatial health database whereby you can type in your address and it will tell you some of these key health metrics. What is the community going through and what are those big priorities? And just by taking some, and it's a little clunky at times, I'm not gonna lie, but by sort of clicking through and understanding that, it at least starts to open up the conversation with the school district. Because these people who are entering the building, whether it's teachers, staff, facility folks, the students themselves, parents, are bringing whatever that health context is in with them in that school. And these things are happening intergenerationally. And so, even if there are adult health metrics, I feel comfortable saying, well, we need to be working on that. And so whether it's CDC Places, whether it's City Health Dashboard, that is coming out of NYU Langone, like there are great health databases that we can get specific on what's happening in that community. And then to sort of these conversations about community engagement, how do you dive deeper then? Like once you get the big brush strokes, this is where we get to have really thoughtful conversation, but we're armed with the basic information from the word go so that we can spend more time on, well, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, so Erika, yes, and you partially answered a question here that was just asked live, so I'll just repeat it. Do you have any knowledge of any resources that link examples of equity components to a school, facilities, book, toolkit, evaluation matrix, etc.? You just listed a few, so let me just say, we can follow up with GBRI, or maybe in a future CHIPS newsletter, we can have a follow up to this webinar where we list some resources. Is there any other one?
References in the slide deck, so when those get uploaded, we can definitely include those. I think to your point, there's no one size fits all, and I think for me, I caveat some of this because I want people to be thinking about it in a tailored way. Restorative justice has to be personal. It has to acknowledge the context and the history. I think there's a lot of good research happening across different fields, and I think if there are individuals who are interested in sort of diving deeper, Tracy and I would sign right on up to start to kind of consolidate that. And what does that mean? And what are those driving questions? And how do we do a better, charrette to ensure that we're getting to that IEP? And so, Tracy is certified in charrettes. I had no idea. And so this is an opportunity for us to, I think, set that course, because what's interesting from an academic perspective is that the research has been focused on environmental justice. It's been focused on some of this sort of, we need movement and attention, but the data has been doing that for decades. And so what we're really at is we need action. And I think together kind of documenting what actions look like for different health conditions, those are the strategies that really, I think, make a difference.
I completely agree. And to echo that from one step further back outside the equity issue, resilience has been a similar topic that has been emerging from a very nebulous concept in this space. So now we have some concrete examples, but we don't have a resource that you can just send somebody to say, hey, this is how you be resilient. It's about place. It's about an individualized plan for a building and a community. So these are two emerging issues that this audience that we've had presentations on that is an evolving process. And I'm gonna, Erika and Tracy, this is something we can do more of together, because there is clearly a need here between EPA, public and nonprofit spaces to do more on these charrettes and equity and building resource kits. Let me get to a couple more questions. I'm going to go to a very specific one from Aaron Flaherty. The video that you shared, Erika, one specific thing that maybe this audience can do better is using some specific tools in charrettes. What tool did you use when doing that charrette?
So we used Mentimeter. basically what you saw is actually we had done an extensive amount of research on these health conditions before. And so we're able to ask the participants really specific questions about lighting, like 10 different things that they could consider and we needed to design for. So those tools are great, but you got to do the homework first to make them really meaningful. But there's a lot of like fun things that you can do with Menti, and people use their phone or on a computer and can very quickly start to virtually or hybrid sort of facilitate those conversations. But Tracy, I'm sure you have a bunch of like tools in your kit.
Well, yeah, so I don't want to overstate my charrette qualification. But I'll tell you, so looking one of the other, but this relates back to one of the other questions about how we're sharing this with school systems from Lily, not just design and construction, but in programming and service units. And so, I kind of backed into this whole charrette thing. I got, it was sort of a booby trap where I was invited to facilitate this event because I do a lot of facilitation, and they were like, "Oh, it's going to be a charrette," and I'm like, "Oh, that's very interesting. Would you come facilitate?" And I'm like, "Well, okay, right." And these were architectural professionals, and so I was like, so when I looked it up, it was like, you need to be a qualified charrette facilitator. And I'm like, well, I'm not that. So I went to the National Charrette Institute. Yes, there is such a thing. And as I was going through, I knew that I wasn't going to be doing architectural building charrettes, but I was thinking about, how do you apply this to policy? How do you apply this to indoor air quality and the indoor air quality program and plan? Yeah. And so in doing that, we, so we kind of, we charretted the charrette in a way that made it, sort of a policy charrette. And in that way, we were able to really engage teachers and, custodial staff and, everyone in this process of design and continuous feedback and rebuilding and redesigning. So it gave them sort of those chops for it. And which then I think makes them better clients, better customers, more informed consumers, better able to engage in the process.
Tracy, I completely agree. We could go down further, but there's a question that I think we can tie that into. And what you just said is that that process helps everyone get a little bit more aware that, hey, we can do this collaboratively. We can listen, we can share ideas, we can ideate, we can brainstorm. It was a question from Lily Berrios, who, how are you sharing this with school systems, not just the design and construction, but the programmatic and service units? So
So that was it was Lily's question that I was kind of tying in there. Great. Exactly.
Okay.
So the more that we are engaging, one of the first things that we recommend for school districts when they're just putting in place an indoor air quality management program is that they bring together an interdisciplinary team around indoor air quality. And if you do that, if you get like smart and focused around that, you're not going to stop at indoor air quality, right? You're going to, once they set that up, now you have, an entire, environmental health, team. It grows and it starts to naturally make those connections between all kinds of facility issues, from planning through design, through construction, through maintenance, through all of that. So it really is creating a place at the table for that conversation, and that lets people know, like we said, everybody in that building's an educator, everybody's a facility manager, everybody's a healthcare provider.
Yeah, excellent. I think we got through all of the. Oh yeah, you're very welcome, Lily. I think we got through all of the questions there. We are at time, so I have a couple of closing thoughts. First of all, I want to echo everything that was said in the chat. Thank you both so much. This was an excellent presentation. We could go on and on about this, which leads me to my follow-up for the audience here. If you want to hear more on this topic, please email GBRI or info@chips.net. Go to our website. This is what we do: is we find content that you need and you want, and we find the professionals to do that. We were so grateful to have Erika and Tracy here. This is going to be an ongoing body of work that you two are going to continue forward. I hope that we can be a part of in the future. So thank you for your time today, for both of you, and audience. Thank you for sticking with such a great presentation through the hour here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Last plug is we do have our next webinar is on the slide here. That is going to be more concrete on healthy products and where architects and designers can go to find products that help enhance the the students' health and well-being of a school building. So much more practical for a designer. Yeah, and that's it.
Thank y'all both. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today.